Have the corporate giants of America left ordinary citizens isolated and powerless? That is the premise of upcoming book Tyranny Inc, which discusses how political leaders in the States gave big businesses more freedom in the expectation that it would improve the economy and society. But the book argues that the opposite has occurred and that the situation has deteriorated to the point where it calls private tyranny is taking away people's liberties. Tyranny Inc is a book by Sohrab Ahmari, which he will be joining us very, very shortly. But before he does, I just want to talk to my dualist momentarily. Do you think, I know what Laura's going to say, so I'll start with you, Emma. Do you think big business is becoming too big?
I think that we have a problem with large corporates, including tech companies, having too much control, particularly over what you could call the intellectual supply chain. I think that is a real concern. I think that corporate monopolies is always a problem. I haven't read Sohrab's book, so I don't know to what degree I agree with him. I know that I agree with Sohrab on a lot of things that he's written in the past. But it depends very much on exactly what you mean by that. But I do think that corporates having far too much power, of course, is a problem.
OK, Emma's on the fence. Laura, big business is too big, isn't it?
Absolutely. I want to know what he thinks the solution is.
Okay.
What's the solution? I think that the problem is in this country that Conservatives don't really know what they stand for. Is it free market capitalism? Is it protectionism? I don't really know what the solution to this is, but it's as though big business is almost like mini countries. You know, the number of employees they have, the global reach they have through their audiences, especially the big tech companies. They're almost operating like de facto governments.
Well, they are. Let's see what Sohrab thinks of this, because Tyranny Inc. is written by the author and columnist Sohrab Ahmari, and I'm delighted to say he joins me now from New York. Good evening. I'm glad you could make it. Tell us, first of all, what is big business and why is it too big?
Well, thank you for having me. Big business is big and has been since the 19th century on both sides of the Atlantic because concentration makes sense in an industrial age. You cannot have as many tire manufacturers as you do small-time restaurants. Technology, the big tech was mentioned. Large network industries cannot be done by small business. So in a way, big business, either markets that are dominated by one single important seller or just a handful, which we call oligopoly, is sort of inevitable. It's the result of industrialization. So it's been something that's been with us since the 19th century. And in many ways, big business is rational because it's only big business that can afford the research and development that innovation requires. It's it is very good for consumers in many cases because it's actually rational, brings prices down. So the problem is that when there's no one on the other side of that kind of concentration of power to push back against it. The way that in the middle of the 20th century, Social Democrats, Christian Democrats, New Dealers in the United States solved this problem was not necessarily by smashing every big business into tiny bits, because that's irrational, but by raising up the power of consumers and workers on the other side, most notably through labor unions, but also through consumer co-ops, and so on, all these ways that allowed people who are on the other side of big business to pool their power so they have greater bargaining power. And we've lost that over the past two generations, especially in Britain and the United States, which went furthest with the kind of neoliberal or libertarian ideology of figures like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. They were responding to real crises at the time, but I argue that they went too far and we've lost too much of the sort of mid-century, I'm talking about the mid-20th century social compact that involved, labor unions, workers, consumers, other kind of socially weaker people having a greater say in how big business operates.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that Thatcher and Reagan had the right solution for the time, but Conservatives since then have kind of adopted that model as the default approach, and the free market has become an ideology in itself, hasn't it, rather than a means to an end. But I really want to get to the crux of the matter here. What is big business? Are we talking here about, when we mentioned big tech? Are we talking about Facebook and Twitter having too much authority? Or are we talking about the level above that? Are we talking about Vanguard and BlackRock and these corporations that are invested in literally every single major corporation around the world and have gone around the idea of democracy in that they have all the authority, they have all the power, and they're unelected?
Well, it's sort of all of the above, right? So big tech controls not just the kind of ad markets, digital ad markets, but also what we get to say and think increasingly. And we've seen that over the past few years with their enormous powers of censorship, sometimes deployed in collusion with governments and sometimes quite on their own. You did mention finance, right? The financial industry has taken on, since the neoliberal era, since the 1980s and after, has taken on a really unusual role in the economy. This is on both sides of the Atlantic. We're talking private equity, asset managers, and hedge funds. It used to be that these banks, essentially, if they were in finance, their role was to support people in the real economy. So I have a product, I'm a company, and I have a profitable product. I think it's going to be profitable. I go to the bank, I borrow money, and they help me develop it and then bring it to a market. That was a normal role. But what we have, again, over the past 2 generations is Wall Street and these kind of finance firms increasingly being in the driver's seat of the economy, and their mentality is not to grow enterprises for the long term. They don't look out for the well-being of workers and consumers. It's all a kind of short-term profit seeking. And so in order to do that, they often asset strip businesses rather than invest in businesses that they take over. They sort of just swallow their assets and they pocket all the gains, while workers and communities who lose jobs and factories end up holding the bag.
So I've been guilty of this myself in the past, of supporting an unregulated, open, free market with the idea that the market will solve the problems. I don't think that's as true as I did think it was at the time, but I'm still cautious about the word regulation, because I understand that big business finds it much easier to work around regulation than small business does. So is part of the answer regulation, and is the other part of the answer getting conservatives to rediscover what it means to be conservative again and move away from neoliberalism?
I mean, regulation is part of the answer, and in a way it's inevitable, especially not so much in Britain, but here in the United States, you still have people on the right who are really, really doctrinaire libertarians, and they say things like we should abolish the administrative state or the regulatory state. Well, I'm sorry, but I invite those people to take the first flights after we get rid of the, government agency that oversees flights. It's called the Federal Aviation Administration. Or to eat the first can of canned food once we've abolished, the Food and Drug Administration. So complex economies require complex regulation, because lawmakers, whether it's Parliament in Britain or Congress in the United States, cannot make laws detailed and granular enough to deal with the complexities of a complex society and economy. So regulation is a part of it. So for example, people wonder, why is it that we're constantly facing canceled flights and delays? It didn't used to be. Every day you take a flight, it seems like it got worse than the last time. Well, it's because airlines, certainly in the United States, used to be a regulated industry. You had all sorts of mechanisms that kept everything stable and looked out for the consumer. That's been gotten rid of, and so consumers are worse off. So regulation is part of it. The bigger part of it is, you're right, that conservatives have to recognize that, and people in the 19th century, figures like Disraeli understood this, that, the market is a good thing, it's a tool, but it's not the be-all, end-all. And we have to have a social vision of what is the good society that we seek after. And then, markets can play a role. They can often efficiently allocate goods, services, and capital, and that's all fine. But sometimes there can be market failure. Sometimes a certain market can be cornered in an unjust way, to the detriment of competitors and to the detriment of consumers and workers. And there we would intervene. And so I'm not calling for socialism. Certainly, I'm not a socialist. I consider myself a kind of conservative social democrat, but a kind of more balanced view, a mixed view of the economy, where you're willing to use the state prudently when it's required. And at the same time, you have private enterprise, because there's a reason why, the Soviet Union didn't work out.
Yeah, it sounds to me like good old-fashioned pragmatic conservatism, and moving away from the ideology of conservatism that we've fallen into in the 21st century.